There are situations where you can have a table that's slow to update. In this case, I grab information from a web page and that can be slow. In this case, this isn't a table that I need to update often. This could maybe be a calendar table that you don't have to update often, if at all, or a table relating to the items you sell or the workers you have. This is something where you'd want to manually update it every so often. I can remove updating this table from my refresh all button here by going into connections and then saying, right now I only have this one query. Then I can say properties and I want to remove this selection so that it no longer updates as part of refresh all. So right now, when I right click and select refresh, this physical table will update. I can then use the physical table as a source to do whatever it is I want to do. In my case, I'm just going to make it simple to make a lookup like I've shown before. So I'd want to have an input box where I can then say what collab do you want to look up. And of course, what I'm doing right now isn't best practice because you'd need to physically update this reference because it's not referencing the collab column. It's instead referencing A2 to A24, but that's fine for the purposes here. I'll just select something and then I need to change the name so that I can use this as a source in Power Query. If I go in like normally and say that my source is a table, I want to first remove this portion. This query is then physically printed inside of my workbook, which means when I use excel.currentWorkbook, I get access to both the query, which is a table, and then right now I have my lookup, which is a named range. Like I said, I don't want to use this as a source because it's going to be slow. Instead, I want to use the physical output as my source. And then I'll get this table, which is physically identical. Right now, this query simply loads the physically loaded table. But I wanted to grab the information from D2, and I can repeat what I've done here. Instead of grabbing the named range from web page, I instead want to grab the D2, which was called lookup. And I can add that as a step before my source step, which is the standard that I prefer using. So I'll say that I want my lookup collab to be equal to this, and then remember the comma, but I'm not looking into from web page, I'm looking into lookup. And then if I wrote that correctly, then I get this, and then I need to extract the first row, and then the column 1. It's the 0th row because index 0 based. Now I have one value, which is a text, which means I can use it as a filter. And that's precisely what I want to do. I can apply a filter, which should then be equal to the keyword lookup collab, which is then the step here. And then I can physically print this on my front page, it should be in D4. And then the nice thing is that when I then change this, I simply have to either right click and say refresh, or I can click the refresh all button, which you'll notice over here, there's no refresh icon from web page, it's only for lookup. And if I were to update this, it's going to be a lot slower. Or at least it normally would be, but this is such a small data set, it doesn't really matter. One extra thing I can do to make this nicer is to make macros so that instead of knowing that you have to go here and right click and refresh, or having the queries open on the side pane, which takes up your screen, I'd rather have a button here. So I can go into Visual Basic. The syntax to updating queries via VBA is a bit tricky, so it's normally something that I have ready as a shorthand, so I simply copy that code. If I want to update a specific query, in this case I want a macro that specifically updates the from web page, then I need to refer specifically to the name, which starts out by going into the current workbook or this workbook, and then I want to look into the connections. And here I need to name the query, but you need to preface it with the word query space dash space. And this depends on your language. So if you're on a Danish computer, you'd need to write forespørgsel, and it may be different in other languages. And then I can write the name. And if you wanted to be cheeky, you could also make this a function if you really want to only update one query at a time. And then this is, like I said, this is why I have it copied, because knowing that you need to write this is not something that comes to mind immediately. But if I then simply press F5, you'll get the update icon and it's updated. So that was macro 1. And then macro 2 is then you can either do a refresh all, which is easy, or you can specifically refresh this one query. And in this case, I'm going to specifically refresh this one. If you then use the macros, you don't actually need to go into the connections and disabling this connection on refresh all, because if you're updating with macros, then you can specify that you only want to update this one specific table. But it's nice to be redundant. In this case, I want to only update the lookup query. And likewise, you start out with this workbook connections, and again, query space dash space, and then the name. And again, if I hit F5, you'll see this update, and then I can add them as buttons. So do lookup, which means all the user has to do is change the selection in the drop-down value, and then press that one button And if you want to be extra nice, you can go into properties and say that it shouldn't adjust column width whenever you update, because this gets super annoying, because this will just keep expanding and contracting. So I prefer not having it. Of course, then you need to make sure that it's actually wide enough. But that was everything for this video. So yep,